The grandfather clock in the grand ballroom of the Henderson estate did not tick. It throbbed, a heavy metallic heartbeat slicing through the suffocating silence of 200 waiting guests. The air was thick with the scent of crushed white roses and expensive champagne, but for Elena Corleone, the atmosphere tasted like ash. She stood beneath the cascading crystal chandelier, her silk crimson gown clinging to her skin like a second blood-soaked layer of armor. Her hands were perfectly still, resting lightly against the cold marble of the balustrade, but beneath that porcelain mask of absolute composure, a violent roaring tempest was tearing through her veins. Hello, my beautiful family, and a deeply warm welcome to every single one of you tuning in today. Whether you are listening to this from a quiet room in London, a bustling street in New York, or a cozy corner anywhere else across the world, I am so incredibly grateful to have you here with us. Take a deep breath, settle in, and tell me in the comments right now, where are you watching from tonight and how is your heart doing? If you haven't already joined our incredible community, please take a brief second to hit that subscribe button right now. Your immense support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you will not want to miss a single second of the storm that is about to unfold. The double mahogany doors of the ballroom burst open, the heavy brass handles slamming against the walls with a sound like a gunshot. The chatter died instantly, severed mid-breath. Elena didn't flinch. She watched as her husband, Arthur Toretto, stepped into the light of their 5th wedding anniversary gala. He looked every bit the powerful billionaire tycoon the media worshipped. Sharp-jawed, impeccably tailored, possessing a cold, commanding charisma that usually bent rooms to his will. But tonight he wasn't alone. Clutched tightly in his right hand, her fingers laced possessively through his, was Clara Huntington. Clara, a woman 10 years younger, clad in a sheer form-fitting emerald dress that went out of its way to accentuate the unmistakable high-rounded curve of her 5-month pregnant belly. A collective horrified gasp rippled through the high society crowd. Members of the city's elite, prominent board members of the Toretto Corleone shipping empire, and lifelong family friends all froze, their eyes darting frantically between Arthur's shameless entrance and Elena's chillingly calm face. Arthur didn't offer an apology. He didn't look at his wife with remorse or even guilt. Instead, his eyes held a cruel, triumphant glint, the look of a predator who believed he had finally cornered his prey. Without a syllable of explanation to the stunned crowd, Arthur turned to the live orchestra, raising a single authoritative hand. "Play," he commanded, his voice slicing through the silence like a razor blade. "Play the anniversary waltz." The conductor, paralyzed by the sheer toxicity of the moment, looked helplessly toward Elena. When she gave no signal, no scream, no tears, the orchestra struck up the haunting melodic chords of the very song Arthur and Elena had danced to on their wedding day 5 years ago. Elena watched, her breathing shallow but steady as her husband wrapped his arm around Clara's waist, pulling the visibly pregnant Mistress flush against his chest. He led her out onto the center of the polished dance floor, right beneath the golden spotlight meant for his wife. They began to sway, an intimate, agonizingly slow dance. Clara rested her chin on Arthur's shoulder, casting a smug, venomous look directly at Elena over his arm, her hand rubbing her pregnant stomach in a slow, mocking circle. The betrayal wasn't just a knife in the back. It was a public execution of Elena's dignity. Arthur was sending an undeniable message to the board members, the press, and the world. The old queen was being replaced, discarded in the very room where she had built his empire. He believed he had stripped her of everything, her pride, her standing, her future. He believed she would break, burst into tears, and flee into the night, leaving him to claim the totality of the family fortune. But as the music swelled and the whispers reached a fever pitch, Elena's lips curved into a tiny, barely perceptible, terrifying smile. Arthur thought he knew the woman he married. He thought she was just a wealthy heiress who had grown soft in his shadow. He had completely forgotten whose blood ran through her veins, and he had no idea that the trap he thought he had set for her was actually closing around his own neck. What Arthur Toretto didn't know was that tonight would not be the night of Elena's ruin. It was the night of his undoing. The haunting notes of the waltz lingered in the cavernous ballroom, but for Elena, the music shifted into a dull, distant roar. She stood unmoving, a statue of crimson silk, watching her husband's fingers trace the small of Clara's back. To the 200 socialites whispering behind their crystal flutes, Elena looked like a victim frozen by shock. But internally, her mind was hyper-focused, cataloging every micro-expression, every smug glance from the board members who had secretly aligned with Arthur, and every heavy, deliberate step her husband took on the polished wood. Elena had spent 5 years building this man from a brilliant but struggling executive into the undisputed titan of the Toretto Corleone shipping empire. Her deepest desire had never been the glittering parties or the endless vaults of wealth. It was legacy. Having lost her mother at a young age and being raised by a fiercely protective, formidable father, Elena valued absolute loyalty above all else. She had genuinely loved Arthur, believing his fierce ambition matched her own deep-seated devotion. Her greatest fear, one she had buried deep beneath layers of corporate strategy and elegant poise, was that she would open her heart completely only to find she had invested her life's work into a mirage. Tonight, that fear had manifested in the most grotesque display possible. Across the room, standing near the towering ice sculpture that was rapidly melting under the heat of the ballroom lights, stood Dominic Vance, the Empire's chief legal counsel and Elena's lifelong confidant. His knuckles were white against his glass, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his tanned skin. Dominic was the only one who truly knew the depth of Elena's sacrifices. He knew that the very foundation of the Toretto Corleone merger rested on assets uniquely tied to Elena's maternal lineage. Assets Arthur had been aggressively trying to restructure for the past 18 months under the guise of tax optimization. Dominic caught Elena's eye across the crowded room. He gave a microscopic shake of his head, a silent plea for her to remain calm, to not let Arthur provoke her into a public outburst that could jeopardize her legal standing. Elena responded with a single, slow blink. He was not going to scream. He was not going to break. Arthur spun Clara past the head table, his eyes locked onto his wife with a chilling, calculated defiance. He was a man driven by an insatiable need for absolute control. Born with nothing, Arthur hated the lingering perception that his success was a byproduct of his wife's elite family name. For years he had worn a mask of the doting, grateful husband, but beneath that facade grew a bitter resentment. He didn't just want to separate from Elena. He wanted to utterly deconstruct her. He needed the world to see her as weak, obsolete, and discarded, ensuring that when the divorce papers were finalized, the public and the shareholders would view his transition to Clara and their unborn heir as a natural, necessary evolution of the company. Clara, leaning heavily into Arthur's chest, whispered something into his ear that made him chuckle softly, the sound cutting through the orchestral music. Clara wasn't just a mistress. She was the daughter of a rival logistics tycoon, a woman raised to believe that everything in life could be acquired if one was ruthless enough. She wore her pregnancy like a shield and a crown, casting condescending glances at Elena's midsection. Elena had privately struggled with fertility for years, a painful, quiet grief that Arthur had weaponized against her in their private arguments, blaming her for failing to provide an heir to the empire. Seeing Clara flaunt her pregnancy beneath the anniversary lights was a calculated psychological strike, designed to shatter whatever emotional reserve Elena had left. But Arthur and Clara had miscalculated the fundamental nature of the woman they were trying to destroy. Elena was a Corleone. Her father, the legendary reclusive shipping magnate Anthony Corleone, had taught her how to navigate international waters and ruthless boardrooms long before Arthur had ever learned to tie a tuxedo. Elena had spent the last year silently tracking Arthur's suspicious movements, his offshore transfers and his late-night meetings. She had allowed him to believe he was successfully hiding his affair and his corporate embezzlement because she wanted him to become arrogant. She wanted him to feel completely invincible. Because a man who believes he cannot fall stops looking at the ground beneath his feet. As the waltz reached its crescendo, Arthur brought Clara to a graceful stop right in front of the grand staircase, just a few feet from where Elena stood. The guests held their collective breath, the tension in the room so volatile that a single word could ignite it. Arthur kept his arm firmly around Clara's waist, looking up at his wife with a cold, mocking smile. "Elena," Arthur said, his voice smooth, amplified by the natural acoustics of the high-ceilinged room. "I'm sure you recognize Clara. Given the changing circumstances of our lives, I felt it was only right that she be here tonight to celebrate the closing of one chapter, and the beginning of another." A murmur of disgust and fascination rippled through the crowd. Clara smiled, her hand resting provocatively on her pregnant belly. "Happy anniversary, Elena," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I hope you don't mind us cutting in on your song. Elena looked down at them from the step, her expression completely unreadable. The silence stretched for 5, 10, 15 seconds, becoming so heavy that even Arthur's arrogant smile began to falter slightly under the weight of her stare. If you are holding your breath right now waiting to see how Elena responds to this unforgivable disrespect, you are not alone. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below letting me know. What would you do if you were in Elena's shoes right now? Elena finally took a slow, deliberate step down the stairs, the heels of her red stilettos clicking against the marble like the ticking of a countdown clock. She stopped on the final step, bringing herself eye to eye with her husband and his mistress. I don't mind at all, Arthur, Elena said, her voice terrifyingly calm, carrying clearly to every corner of the silent ballroom. In fact, I'm glad you brought her. It saves me the trouble of having her served at her own home. The word served hung in the air like a heavy mist, suffocating the last remnants of the orchestra's music. Arthur's smile didn't just fade. It hardened into a rigid, dangerous mask. His grip on Clara's waist tightened, causing the younger woman to let out a soft, sharp intake of breath. Served. Arthur scoffed, stepping forward to close the physical gap between himself and Elena, attempting to use his towering height to intimidate her. Elena, don't make a scene. You're embarrassed and I understand that. But let's not play games in front of our guests. If you want to talk about legalities, we can do it tomorrow in my office. Your office? Elena echoed, her voice laced with a cold, mocking amusement that sent a visible shiver through Clara. Arthur, by tomorrow morning, you won't even have a key to that office. Before Arthur could retaliate, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom opened once more. This time it wasn't a grand entrance of high society elites. Two sharply dressed men in dark suits walked into the room, their expressions grim and entirely unbothered by the wealth surrounding them. They bypassed the stunned guests, marching directly up the center of the dance floor. Dominic Vance stepped forward from the shadows of the ice sculpture, a thick leather-bound legal folder in his hands. He opened it, pulling out a stack of stamped, certified documents. Arthur Toretto, Dominic announced, his voice booming with legal authority. As chief legal counsel for the Corleone Foundational Trust, which holds 70% of the voting shares in the Toretto Corleone shipping empire, you are hereby served with an emergency injunction. Effective immediately, your executive powers are suspended pending a forensic audit of the company's international accounts. The ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers. Board members began frantically whispering to one another, their faces turning pale as they realized the implications of Dominic's words. This is absurd. Arthur roared, dropping his hand from Clara entirely as he stepped toward Dominic, his face contorting with rage. I built this company. You can't freeze me out based on the whims of a bitter wife who can't accept that our marriage is over. The board will never ratify this. The board doesn't have a choice, Arthur, Elena whispered. The absolute quietness of her voice instantly drew the room's attention back to her. She stepped off the final marble stair, standing directly in front of Clara. Elena looked down at Clara's hand, which was still resting on her pregnant belly. You came here tonight to show me what you've taken from me, Elena said softly, her eyes piercing into Clara's soul. But you forgot to look at what you're stepping into. Did Arthur tell you how he funded that beautiful diamond bracelet on your wrist? Or the villa in Capri he bought you last month? Clara's smug look finally fractured, replaced by a sudden, creeping panic. Arthur, she whispered, looking at him for protection. Quiet, Clara, Arthur hissed, turning his fury back onto Elena. You have nothing, Elena. A few unsubstantiated claims of infidelity won't break my contracts. The asset restructuring is already complete. I own the logistics network. You own the shell companies, Arthur, Elena corrected him, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. You spent the last 18 months transferring funds into offshore accounts, thinking you were draining my family's legacy. But you see, Dominic and I have been watching every single wire transfer. We didn't stop you because we needed you to commit the crime in its entirety. The assets you thought you transferred into your private accounts, they never left our network. We rerouted them. You didn't steal our wealth, Arthur. You systematically documented your own grand larceny. Arthur's face drained of color. He looked from Elena to Dominic, and then to the two men in dark suits who had now taken up positions right behind him. And as for the board, Elena continued, turning her back on him to face the crowd of stunningly silent socialites and business magnates. Anyone who signed off on Arthur's restructuring over the past year will find their resignation letters drafted on my desk by 8 a.m. tomorrow. If they are not signed, the forensic files go directly to the federal prosecutors. Are you sensing the tables turning? If your jaw dropped just now, hit that subscribe button right away and leave a comment below with the word justice. Arthur took a step toward Elena, his hands curling into tight fists, his carefully curated public image completely shattering. "You arrogant bitch," he snarled, dropping all pretense of elegance. "You think you can ruin me? You're nothing without me. You're an empty, lonely woman who couldn't even give me a child." The insult was meant to break her, to pierce the one vulnerable spot she had left. Clara let out a small, cruel gasp of triumph, believing Arthur had delivered the killing blow. But before Arthur could take another step, a cold, heavy voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase, cutting through the tension like a guillotine. "If you ever speak to my daughter like that again, Arthur, the shipping empire will be the very least of your worries." Arthur froze. Every head in the ballroom snapped upward. Standing at the top of the stairs, flanked by two towering security guards, was Anthony Corleone, the reclusive, legendary patriarch who hadn't been seen in public for 3 years. He looked older, his hair completely silver, but his eyes held the exact same lethal, unyielding steel that had built an international monopoly. The true trap had just snapped shut. The sudden appearance of Anthony Corleone sent a shockwave through the ballroom so profound that the heavy silence returned instantly, twice as suffocating as before. Arthur's chest heaved as he stared up at the man who had effectively given him his career, his status, and his power. For 5 years, Arthur had operated under the assumption that the aging patriarch was too frail, too disconnected from the daily operations of the Corleone holdings to notice the slow bleeding of the company's core assets. Seeing Anthony standing there, looking down at him with an expression of cold disgust, stripped away the last remnants of Arthur's bravado. "Anthony," Arthur stammered, his voice losing its sharp, commanding edge, falling into a defensive pitch. This is a private family matter. Elena is blowing a routine marital dispute out of proportion to sabotage a massive corporate transition. The restructuring was done to protect the company's future. Do not insult my intelligence by calling your theft a corporate transition, Anthony said, his deep voice carrying a terrifying weight as he began a slow, deliberate descent down the marble staircase. The two security guards moved in perfect synchronization behind him, their eyes locked fixedly on Arthur. "Every contract you signed, every hidden ledger you authorized, and every shell company you registered under Clara's father's name has been sitting on my desk for months. You thought you were playing chess, Arthur. But you were merely moving pieces on a board my daughter drew for you." Clara shrunk back, her fingers digging frantically into Arthur's sleeve. "Arthur, let's go," she whispered urgently, her eyes darting toward the two men in dark suits who had subtly shifted their positioning, blocking the main exit of the ballroom. "We don't have to stay here and listen to this. Call the legal team. Call my father." "Your father can't save him, Clara," Dominic Vance interjected smoothly, stepping forward and tapping the legal folder in his hands. "In fact, your father's logistics firm is currently facing an emergency freeze on all municipal port contracts. The city council revoked their access 45 minutes ago, citing an ongoing investigation into the illegal diverted funds Arthur sent into their accounts. Right now, your family's business is completely gridlocked." Clara's face went entirely pale, her hand dropping from Arthur's arm as if he had suddenly caught fire. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't just helped Arthur steal from a vulnerable wife. She had guided her own family's legacy into a meat grinder engineered by the Corleones. Arthur looked around the room, his eyes wild and desperate as he searched the faces of his board members. Men who had toasted to his health just an hour prior now looked away, suddenly fascinated by the patterns on the carpet or the bubbles in their champagne glasses. The alliance he had meticulously built behind Elena's back had vanished the very second Anthony Corleone walked down those stairs. "You think you've won?" Arthur hissed, turning back to Elena, his voice cracking with a toxic mix of panic and rage. "You think you can just erase me from this empire? The shareholders know my face. The market reacts to my name. If you remove me, the stock plunges by morning. You'll destroy the very legacy you're trying to protect. Elena didn't back down. She stepped closer to him, so close that Arthur could see the absolute lack of fear in her dark eyes. The market reacts to stability, Arthur. And tomorrow morning the public will learn that the brilliant Arthur Toretto was caught in a routine forensic audit and has stepped down due to severe, irreversible personal and legal complications. The transition will be seamless, because Dominic will be stepping in as interim CEO. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink into his collapsing psyche. You built a house of cards on sand, Arthur. And you forgot who owns the shoreline. If you can feel the absolute heat coming off Elena's words right now, make sure to hit that subscribe button immediately and drop a comment below with your favorite line from this showdown so far. Arthur's gaze darted toward the side exit, his mind clearly racing to formulate a backup plan, an escape route, anything to get out of the suffocating trap of the ballroom. But the tension in the room was a living thing, tightening around his throat with every second that passed. He was no longer the triumphant husband dancing with his pregnant mistress. He was a cornered thief waiting for the cell door to slam shut. The air in the grand ballroom grew frigid, the kind of heavy, pressurized cold that precedes a structural collapse. Arthur's desperate gaze flicked from Elena to Anthony, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo. He was looking for a crack, a single weakness in the Corleone armor he could exploit to save himself. You think you've mapped out every variable, Elena, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, venomous register that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He slowly smoothed the lapels of his jacket, forcing a sickening theatrical calm back into his demeanor. You think this is just about corporate shares and offshore bank accounts? You think you're punishing me for taking Clara to the dance floor? Elena kept her posture rigid, her chin lifted high. I am stripping a thief of the assets he tried to steal, Arthur. Nothing more, nothing less. A thief. Arthur let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter that made several nearby guests flinch. He turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder toward the massive, arched stained glass windows that looked out over the sprawling estate. You always were blinded by your own righteousness, Elena. You legacy-obsessed aristocrats think the world moves because of your old family names. You think I spent 18 months transferring funds just to build a comfortable nest egg with Clara? Clara looked up at Arthur, a sudden flicker of confusion crossing her pale face. Arthur, what are you talking about? Arthur didn't look at his mistress. His eyes were locked entirely on Elena, watching for the exact moment the floor fell out from beneath her. Dominic told you that my shell companies were routing money to Clara's father's firm. And that was true. It was a beautiful shiny red herring that you and your forensic team swallowed whole. Dominic Vance frowned, his fingers tightening against the leather-bound legal folder. The wire transfers are verified, Arthur. Every single dollar is accounted for. You can't bluff your way out of a digital paper trail. I'm not bluffing, Dominic, Arthur whispered, his smile widening into something genuinely sinister. The money sent to the Huntington logistics firm wasn't a theft. It was a payout. A premium. Tell me, Elena, did your brilliant forensic audit happen to look into the regulatory approval files for the Southern Deepwater Port expansion? The one your father staked the entire family foundation on. The mention of the Southern Port caused Anthony Corleone to freeze midway down the grand staircase. His grip on the marble balustrade tightened so hard his knuckles turned a ghostly white. Elena caught the sudden shift in her father's posture, a cold spike of dread piercing through her calm facade for the very first time tonight. Arthur, what did you do? I didn't do anything, Arthur purred, taking a slow, predatory step toward her, reclaiming the territory he had lost just moments before. I merely facilitated a transaction. 5 years ago, when your father gifted us this merger as a wedding present, he didn't do it out of love. He did it because the Corleone Empire was already rotting from the inside out. The Southern Port expansion was illegal. The environmental permits were forged, signed by a corrupt minister who died 2 years ago. If that expansion project fails, the Corleone Foundation is legally liable for billions in environmental damages and municipal fraud. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the high society crowd. The board members looked at each other, their faces completely transformed by this sudden, catastrophic revelation. He's lying, Dominic said, though his voice lacked its previous absolute certainty. He immediately pulled out a tablet from his folder, his thumbs flying across the screen as he accessed deeper, encrypted layers of the corporate database. I'm not lying, Dominic, and you know it, Arthur sneered, his voice ringing with absolute triumph. I didn't steal that money to hide it from Elena. I used those offshore accounts to buy up the debt of the very construction entities holding those forged permits. Clara's father didn't take a bribe. His firm was the one holding the original, uncorrupted environmental blueprints. By routing the money through him, I didn't just drain the Corleone accounts. I purchased the absolute, undeniable proof of your father's corporate fraud. Arthur reached into his breast pocket. The two dark-suited security guards instantly stepped forward, their hands moving toward their jackets, but Arthur merely pulled out a small, encrypted black flash drive. He held it up between two fingers, letting the crystal chandelier light catch its metallic edge. On this drive are the original unedited satellite surveys and the real municipal ledgers from 5 years ago, Arthur announced, turning his gaze to the entire room, ensuring every board member and socialite heard his ultimatum. If I am suspended, if my executive powers are stripped, or if a single forensic file is handed over to a prosecutor, this drive goes directly to the International Maritime Authority. By tomorrow morning, the Corleone name won't just be ruined. Anthony will be watching the collapse of his empire from a federal prison cell. Are you feeling the absolute shock of this massive twist? If your heart is pounding right now, hit that subscribe button immediately and drop a comment below letting me know. Do you think Elena can find a way out of this trap? Clara let out a shaky breath, a slow, triumphant smirk returning to her lips as she realized Arthur had played a game entirely beyond the Corleone's comprehension. She stepped back to his side, crossing her arms over her pregnant stomach, looking down at Elena with pure malice. It looks like the anniversary waltz isn't over after all, Elena. Elena stood entirely still, the crimson silk of her gown suddenly feeling like a heavy shroud. She looked up at her father. Anthony, the unyielding patriarch who had always seemed invincible to her, looked down at her with a profound, breaking sorrow in his eyes. He didn't deny it. The silent confession written across her father's aging face tore a deeper wound into Elena's heart than any of Arthur's infidelities ever could. Arthur had known. He had known before he ever proposed to her. Their entire marriage, his declarations of love, his promises of building a future together, it was all a calculated long-term acquisition strategy designed to hold a knife to her family's throat. So, my beautiful wife, Arthur whispered, leaning down so his breath brushed against her ear, his voice dripping with absolute toxic victory. Are we still going to talk about serving me papers? Or are you going to sit back down, let me finish my dance with Clara, and accept that I own you? The ballroom felt as though it had been drained of oxygen. The triumphant smirks of Arthur and Clara contrasted sharply with the pale, frozen faces of the guests. Elena stood completely paralyzed as the true scope of the devastation settled over her. The man she had loved, the man she had poured her heart, intellect, and soul into for 5 years, had never truly been her husband. He was a corporate parasite who had infected her family's legacy from the very beginning, waiting for the perfect moment to burst through the skin and take everything. Anthony, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the silence like a jagged blade as he looked past Elena toward the stairs. I'll give you and your daughter exactly 60 seconds to clear this room. Take your security, take your loyal little dog Dominic, and get out. Tomorrow we negotiate the total transfer of the Corleone foundational shares into my name. If I see a single police officer or regulatory agent near my office, the flash drive is delivered. Anthony Corleone looked down at his daughter, his shoulders uncharacteristically slumped. The legendary titan looked utterly defeated, broken by the weight of a past sin he had desperately tried to bury. He began to descend the stairs, not with the commanding presence of a monarch, but with the heavy, dragging steps of a man walking toward his own execution. Elena, Anthony whispered as he reached the bottom, his voice trembling as he reached out a frail, shaking hand toward her. I'm sorry. I did it to save us 5 years ago. I never wanted you to be the one to pay the price. Elena looked at her father's hand, but for the first time in her life she couldn't take it. The betrayal was too multi-layered, too crushing. Her husband was a monster, her father's legacy was built on a lie, and the empire she had dedicated her life to protecting was nothing more than a beautifully decorated trap. Clara let out a soft, mocking laugh, taking Arthur's arm once more and leaning her head against his shoulder. Don't look so sad, Elena, she whispered, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. You can keep the crimson dress. Consider it a parting gift from the new owners. Dominic Vance stared at his tablet, his face grim as his fingers flew across the screen, trying to find a legal loophole, an encrypted countermeasure, anything to salvage the wreckage. But he slowly looked up at Elena, his eyes filled with absolute despair, and gave a devastating, definitive shake of his head. There was no backup plan. There was no secret account. Arthur had won completely. The guests began to filter out of the room in a panicked, uncomfortable rush, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of the city's greatest dynasty. Elena stood entirely alone in the center of the massive empty dance floor, surrounded by melting ice sculptures, abandoned champagne flutes, and the suffocating echo of her own shattered life. The spotlight that had been meant to celebrate her love now felt like a blinding, mocking interrogation lamp. She had lost her marriage, her future, and her family's honor in a single devastating hour. If you are feeling the crushing weight of Elena's darkest hour right now, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below with a message of hope for her. Don't leave her alone in the dark. Arthur didn't even watch her leave. He turned back to Clara, pulling her into his arms to resume their slow, triumphant dance beneath the crystal chandelier, completely unbothered by the ghost of the woman they had just destroyed standing mere feet away. Elena turned slowly, her vision blurring with the first hot, stinging tears she had allowed herself all night, and walked out into the freezing darkness of the rain-slicked night. The torrential rain slammed against the black-tinted windows of Anthony Corleone's private limousine, mirroring the chaotic storm raging inside Elena's chest. The vehicle sat idling at the edge of the estate's cliffside overlook. Inside the cabin, the silence was broken only by the muffled sound of thunder rolling across the bay. Elena sat perfectly upright in the leather seat, staring straight ahead. The tears that had threatened to blind her moments ago had completely evaporated, dried by an icy volcanic wrath that was rapidly replacing her despair. Beside her, Anthony looked small, his gaze fixed on his hands. Dominic sat opposite them, his laptop open, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glare of data streams. "Elena," Anthony began, his voice cracked with age and sorrow. "I never intended for you to bear this weight. 5 years ago the ministry was going to seize our assets. I thought by merging with Arthur's rising firm, we could absorb the liabilities. I believed he loved you. I thought I was protecting you." "You were protecting a lie, father," Elena said. Her voice didn't shake. It was flat, cold, and sharper than any blade Arthur had wielded tonight. "And in doing so you handed him the guillotine. The legal leverage he holds is absolute, Elena," Dominic muttered, rubbing his temples in utter exhaustion. "If that encrypted drive is delivered to the Maritime Authority, it triggers an automated global freeze on every vessel flying the Corleone flag. We won't just be bankrupt. We will be criminally liable in 4 different jurisdictions." Elena turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto Dominic. "What did Arthur say about the environmental blueprints, Dominic? Exactly what were his words?" Dominic blinked, caught off guard by the sudden, intense focus in her eyes. "He said Clara's father's firm, Huntington Logistics, held the original uncorrupted environmental blueprints. He claimed he used our diverted funds to buy up the debt of the construction entities holding the forged permits, making him the sole owner of the proof." Elena's lips thinned into a terrifyingly sharp, calculated line. "He bought the debt of the construction entities. But who owns the physical land where the deepwater port expansion is actually being built?" Dominic froze. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as a sudden realization flashed across his eyes. The southern coastal parcel. It was held by a blind ancestral trust established by your maternal grandfather in 1974. "Exactly," Elena whispered, leaning forward, the fire in her soul fully ignited. "Arthur spent 18 months studying our corporate ledger, but he never understood our family's history. He thinks everything can be bought with money because he is a man without a foundation. He bought the contracts, he bought the permits, and he bought the debt. But he does not own the earth beneath the concrete." She tapped the laptop screen. "Look up the 1974 trust bylaws, Dominic. Check the specific clause regarding environmental contamination and third-party liabilities." Dominic's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing firewalls and drilling deep into the most secure historical vaults of the Corleone family archives. As the text scrolled down his screen, a slow, disbelieving breath escaped his lips. "My God," Dominic breathed, looking up at Elena with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. The trust stipulates that if any corporate entity attempts to develop or alter the parcel using fraudulent or non-compliant environmental metrics, ownership of all assets, structures, and equipment built upon that land automatically forfeits to the direct maternal heir. To you. Arthur didn't buy a weapon to destroy us, Dominic, Elena said, her voice ringing with a cold, triumphant certainty that shattered the last remnants of the car's suffocating atmosphere. He spent 18 months and billions of dollars of our diverted funds building a massive, state-of-the-art deepwater port infrastructure directly onto land that he has just legally forfeited to me. The moment he brings that flash drive to light to prove the fraud, he doesn't jail my father, he triggers the forfeiture clause. He will legally hand me total ownership of his entire logistics network, completely free of debt. Anthony looked up, a spark of the old, unyielding titan returning to his eyes as he stared at his daughter. He trapped himself. He trapped himself because he let his arrogance dance with his greed, Elena said, brushing a stray drop of rain from her crimson silk sleeve. He wanted to humiliate me in front of the world. Now I am going to let him watch the sky fall on his head. Are you ready to see the ultimate queen claim her throne? If your heart is racing right now, hit that subscribe button immediately and drop a comment below with the word Queen. Elena turned to Dominic, her jaw set, her eyes shining with absolute, unadulterated power. Turn the car around, Dominic. We are going back to the ballroom. The anniversary waltz isn't over yet. The storm outside raged with a cinematic fury, but inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere had devolved into a premature victory party. The vast majority of the high society guests had fled, leaving only the inner circle of corrupt board members, Clara's father, the smug logistics tycoon, and a skeleton crew of catering staff. At the center of the room, Arthur and Clara stood clinking crystal flutes of vintage champagne. Arthur's arm was wrapped tightly around Clara's waist, his laughter echoing off the high, gilded ceilings. He had done the impossible. He had brought the legendary Corleone dynasty to its knees using their own money, their own secrets, and their own vulnerability. To the new era of the Toretto Empire, Clara's father toasted, raising his glass with a predatory grin. And to the foolish woman who thought she could stand in the way of progress. Elena was soft, Arthur sneered, taking a slow sip of his champagne, his eyes scanning the empty grand staircase where he had so thoroughly shattered his wife's dignity. She inherited a name, but she never had the stomach for the blood sport of real power. By tomorrow morning she'll be hiding in some European villa, weeping over her broken marriage while we control the entire coastline. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a resounding, thunderous crash that shattered a glass on a nearby table. Arthur choked on his drink, spinning around. Clara let out a sharp gasp, her hand instinctively flying to her pregnant belly. Walking through the threshold, completely unbothered by the rain dripping from her dark hair, was Elena. She had discarded the damp shawl, standing tall in her crimson silk gown, looking less like a discarded wife and more like an executioner arriving to fulfill a sentence. Flanking her were Dominic Vance and Anthony Corleone, his frail posture entirely gone, replaced by the rigid, terrifying bearing of the patriarch who had ruled the international waters for 40 years. Behind them stood 4 federal marshals, their golden badges gleaming beneath the crystal chandeliers. Elena, Arthur stammered, his face instantly contorting into a mixture of disbelief and soaring rage. He stepped forward, slamming his champagne flute onto a table. You arrogant fool. Did you not understand my terms? I told you to get out of my sight. If you think bringing a few marshals here will scare me, you've just signed your father's prison warrant. Arthur pulled the encrypted black flash drive from his pocket, holding it high in the air like a weapon. I will transmit this file right now. I will ruin everything you love before the sun rises. Elena didn't stop walking. She marched right down the center of the dance floor, stopping precisely on the golden spotlight where Arthur had shamelessly danced with Clara just an hour ago. She looked at the flash drive in his hand and then up into his eyes, her expression utterly devoid of fear. Transmit it, Arthur, Elena said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that cut through the cavernous room like a guillotine. Arthur blinked, his thumb hovering over the activation button of the drive. Don't bluff me, Elena. I know about the forged environmental permits for the southern port expansion. I know your father staked the entire foundation's liquidity on that project. If I press this, the International Maritime Authority freezes the Corleone flag globally. I'm not blubbing, Arthur. I am telling you to press the button, Elena repeated, taking a final step forward, bringing herself inches from him. Because what you don't know, what your greed blinded you from checking, is who owns the physical land beneath that deepwater port expansion. Dominic Vance stepped forward, opening the leather folder and pulling out a certified, historically sealed document bearing the crest of the 1974 Corleone Ancestral Trust. Arthur Toretto, Dominic announced, his voice booming with absolute legal triumph. Pursuant to the strict, unalterable bylaws of the maternal trust established by Elena's grandfather, any corporate development enacted on that parcel using fraudulent, non-compliant, or forged environmental metrics triggers an immediate, automated, and irreversible asset forfeiture clause. The developer forfeits all structures, equipment and logistics networks built upon that earth directly to the sole maternal heir. Dominic looked up from the paper, a cold, mocking smile playing on his lips. To Elena Corleone. Arthur's hand began to shake. The absolute certainty in Dominic's voice tore a massive hole in his armor. No, that's impossible. I bought the construction debt. I own the shell companies that funded the infrastructure. You funded it with our stolen money, Arthur, Elena whispered, her voice ringing with a brutal, righteous satisfaction. You spent 18 months transferring billions of dollars out of my family's accounts, thinking you were draining my blood. But all you did was build a multi-billion-dollar global deepwater port infrastructure directly onto my land. The moment you transmit that flash drive to prove the environmental fraud, you don't destroy my father. You legally activate the forfeiture clause. You will systematically hand me total, unencumbered ownership of your entire logistics network, completely free of debt, while proving your own grand larceny. Clara's father stepped forward, his face turning an ash-gray color as he looked at the legal documents in Dominic's hands. Arthur, tell me this isn't true. Our entire firm's capital is tied up in those construction entities. If those assets forfeit to her, we are completely ruined. Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. His gaze darted from Elena to the federal marshals, and then down to the tiny black flash drive in his hand. The weapon he had spent nearly 2 years engineering, the lever he thought gave him absolute control over the woman he despised, was actually the anchor dragging him down into an abyss. He was trapped by his own genius, outmaneuvered by the very woman he had called soft. If your heart is pounding wildly at this absolute masterpiece of a trap turning back on the villain, hit that subscribe button right now and flood the comments with the word checkmate. You thought I was just an ornament in your shadow, Arthur, Elena said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, absolute power. You thought you could bring your pregnant mistress into my home, dance to our wedding song under my lights and watch me quietly disappear. You forgot that I was a Corleone long before I ever had the misfortune of carrying your last name. Elena turned her back on him, looking toward the federal marshals. Marshals, Mr. Toretto and Mr. Huntington have just confessed to a multi-million-dollar international wire fraud, corporate embezzlement and attempted extortion. You may execute the warrants. The lead marshal stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Arthur Toretto, you are under arrest. Arthur let out a guttural, desperate roar of denial, dropping the flash drive as he tried to take a step back, but the two dark-suited marshals slammed him face-first onto the polished wood of the dance floor, the very spot where he had tried to execute his wife's dignity. The metallic clink of the handcuffs locking around his wrists was the loudest sound in the room. Clara screamed, falling back against a table, her hands clutching her pregnant stomach as she watched the father of her unborn child get dragged to his knees, his face smeared with the dust of the floor he thought he owned. She looked up at Elena, her eyes filled with a desperate, terrified pleading. Elena, please. I didn't know. He lied to me too. Think about the baby. Elena paused, looking down at Clara Huntington from the height of her absolute triumph. There was no hatred left in Elena's eyes. Only a cold, devastating pity. The baby will be cared for, Clara. I am not a monster, Elena said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made the younger woman shrink back in shame. But as for you and Arthur, you wanted my throne. Now you can share his cell. The heavy iron gates of the Henderson estate clicked shut behind the departing police cruisers, the flashing red and blue lights fading into the damp morning mist. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crisp, clean dawn that painted the eastern horizon in brilliant streaks of gold and lavender. Inside the grand ballroom, the suffocating tension had vanished, replaced by a profound, cleansing stillness. The catering staff had quietly cleared away the remnants of the ruined gala, leaving the vast space empty, bright, and renewed by the morning sun streaming through the towering stained glass windows. Elena stood by the high glass doors leading out to the balcony, a warm porcelain cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She had long since changed out of the heavy crimson silk gown, now wearing a simple, elegant ivory knit sweater and tailored trousers. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face that looked entirely at peace. The heavy shadows of a 5-year deception finally lifted from her shoulders. Anthony Corleone walked into the room, his footsteps light and steady on the polished wood. The frail, defeated posture he had carried into the ballroom the night before was entirely gone. He looked at his daughter, his eyes shining with a deep, emotional pride that words could barely contain. "The federal prosecutors just called Dominic," Anthony said softly, stepping up to stand beside her. "Arthur and Huntington are being held without bail. The forensic files we submitted were so airtight that their legal team is already advising them to discuss a plea arrangement. The southern port expansion is entirely ours now, Elena. Legally, cleanly, and permanently." Elena took a slow sip of her coffee, looking out over the sparkling, sunlit waters of the bay. "It was never just about the port, Father. It was about cleaning the foundation. A house cannot stand if its pillars are built on secrets." Anthony placed a gentle, steady hand on her shoulder. "You didn't just save the empire, Elena. You saved me from my own past. You are twice the leader I ever was." "I am a Corleone," Elena said, turning to him with a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. "We don't break. We rebuild." Dominic Vance entered the ballroom, his tablet tucked under his arm, a wide, triumphant smile stretching across his face. "Good morning, O Corleone," he teased gently, bowing with playful theatricality. "The international markets just opened. The corporate transition announcement went live 30 minutes ago. As predicted, the market didn't panic at Arthur's removal. In fact, our stock value just jumped 7% on the news of your sole leadership." Elena laughed, a light, free sound that seemed to chase away the last lingering echoes of the anniversary waltz. "Thank you, Dominic, for everything. I couldn't have turned the tide without you." "You drew the map, Elena," Dominic said, his gaze softening with a deep, lifelong admiration. "I just followed the coordinates." The betrayal had been a fire meant to consume her, but instead, it had merely burned away the illusions, revealing the indestructible steel beneath. Elena looked down at her hands, no longer feeling the phantom weight of a wedding ring that had been a golden handcuff. She was free. Her legacy was secure, her family was united, and her future was an unwritten, brilliant horizon completely of her own making. Thank you all so much for going on this incredible high-stakes emotional journey with us tonight. If you loved watching Elena turn the tables and reclaim her absolute power from those who underestimated her, please make sure to hit that subscribe button right now, turn on your notifications, and drop a comment below letting me know your thoughts on this epic finale. Your amazing support means the world to us, and we cannot wait to bring you the next thrilling story. Until next time, stay strong, stay watchful, and remember exactly who you are.